everyone, and welcome to my two-part series on how to get started with brush lettering. In this section, part one, I want to explain to you all about brush pens, about the beginning steps for brush lettering and how to form the letters, how to get those thick and thin strokes, and there'll be lots of tips and tutorials throughout as we go. Once you've covered this video, skip ahead then to part two because we'll be looking a little more in depth. So I'm going to be starting with these basic brush pens. So they are very inexpensive ones that I picked up from a very inexpensive shop, just to show you that it's not all about the pens that you use, but it's about the technique. So these are what I'm using, and then you can go ahead and you can find the brush pens that you love the most. So don't forget to subscribe, to follow, to find me on all the social media, because things like this I'm going to be uploading again and again, and I'd love to see you and have you join me on my brush lettering journey. So the basics of brush lettering is that you have thick and thin strokes throughout your letters, throughout your fonts. The rule is that the upward strokes, and this also goes for the across strokes, so say you're crossing your T, they will always be thin strokes, okay, like so, always thin strokes. The same goes for flourishes if you're flourishing anything. But then when you do downward strokes, we're going to be doing thicker strokes, and you can see with my brush pen these are very easy to achieve. Okay, so the way to get the two different strokes is really simple. It's not about the pen angle at all, it's all about the pressure, and that's why we use brush nibs. Thick and thin lines are easily achievable when you do have a brush pen. Now a brushed pen will have a very fine point on the end and a wider point towards the barrel of the pen, but it will have flexibility. So as you can see here, I can write with a very light pressure and get thin strokes. But if I press down, the nib is going to bend ever so slightly. Let me just take you a bit closer. So the bend, and that's where you get the pressure. And then if I lift up my pressure, I get thin strokes, like so. So it's the variation between the thick and the thin. Now one stumbling block I've found for some people is the angle in which they hold their pen, or rather the angle in which their hand is to the paper. So if your hand is parallel to the edge of your paper, when you're pressing the nib downwards, you're pressing it down, but you're not getting those thick strokes. The upstrokes would be absolutely fine, but the pressure, you're not getting the entire length of that brush nib on the pen. If this is what's happening with yourself, if you're finding you're struggling with getting really thick strokes, try just adjusting the angle of the paper a little, so that as you go downwards, so if my hand is upwards here, so it's at a right angle to my body, I can still then get the downward brush strokes. The same goes for left-handed people. If you find that you're writing with your hand coming from above, and as you press down you're not getting the thickness on your downstrokes, if you angle ever so slightly, sometimes then you can get a thicker line. Now don't worry about your handwriting at the moment. I have awful handwriting, so what I'm going to do is run through my brush lettered alphabet and give you two variations of each letter. Now I'm going to speed this up, but you can pause it where you want to see the letters, but it also shows you that there's no set rule for each of the letters. You can do them in different ways. I'll give you quite a basic letter, and then I'll give you a flourished or more intricate letter for each one. Once you've grasped the hang of forming your letters, the next stage is to start putting these into words and forming your own font. So now most brush lettering is easiest if you start off with everything on a straight line. Now where we write when we're young, when we're at school, when we've got the lined paper or the gridded paper, you'll have a baseline. This is where your letters sit. So for example, my baseline would be, I'll just write this word out for you. You can see that this is my baseline. But what we can do through lettering is also vary this if you want to. So we could start looking at bringing the baseline down lower on some letters and higher on others, and this gives us more of a funky look to our letters. Now this is great if you've really got the hang of forming your letters already, but while you're still learning, I would always suggest stick with your baseline on one level, get everything neat, start learning how to practice doing those thick and thin lines, and don't forget downwards is always going to be the thick line. You can also vary the spacing if you want to as well, but this is something we're going to cover in part 2 of this video series. Something I also wanted to cover is going from a thin line into a thick line and vice versa when you're doing curves. So for example, if you're doing letter C, if you're doing letter A, or if you're simply doing an O, you'll need to go from thin to thick or thick to thin. Now what we don't want to happen is for this section here, under here, where you're transforming from one thickness to another, we don't want these sections to be almost stumbling along. So for example, if I purposely do this, if I have a light pressure on my pen, let's just get a bit closer, and I go up, and if I think right now here from down I need to go thick, you can see there that I've then got that. And if I do that in more of a fast motion, there we go, you can see how you suddenly have this step from one to another. That's not what we want. We want to have a nice glide. So what I suggest is, as you're coming through from the thin, rather than waiting until you get to this point to start pressing down, actually start pressing down much higher up in the curve. So at the top here, start pressing down, and the same when you come under. So you're actually going to be thinking ahead about where you're going. So if I just verbalise for you, I'm light pressure up to the top, press down now. And you can see you've actually got that nice smooth curve rather than the step from one thickness to another. Thank you for watching part 1. Please do check the description below for the link to follow on with part 2.